Please welcome to the stage Stacy Hawkins, a law professor at Rutgers University, in conversation with Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, academic and author of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Death and How It Changed America, and I May Not Get There With You, the true Martin Luther King Jr. They'll be joined by Jonathan Eig, author of King, A Life.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I have a very easy task this afternoon, which is to simply prompt the genius of these two incredible authors and step out of the way and let them share their brilliance with all of us here this afternoon. So we've been asked to talk about what would King say today. And both of you have written incredible biographies of King, although you did not pick an unfamiliar subject, right, in kind of the American public consciousness. In fact, someone that's quite well known, been written about a lot, someone that is, if you will, seared in our consciousness. I mean, if children learn nothing else during Black History Month, they learn about King and his dream for racial equality. So he's a fairly well-trafficked figure. Tell us why you wrote these books. What did you want to add to the kind of public record about this great man?
First. Well, thanks, and thank you all for joining us today. I felt like we needed King again, but we needed the real King. You know, you mentioned children, every child learns about King during Black History Month, but all they learn is, I have a dream. And that we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. We're taking the soft, the easy, comfortable lessons, the things that make us feel good about our democracy and our country and our race relations. And I felt like we had lost sight of the man. We'd lost sight of his radicalism. We'd lost sight even of his faith in turning him into, 1,000 streets and 100 public schools and a national monument and a national holiday. We have watered him down. And one of the things Harry Belafonte said to me over and over, I interviewed something like 200 people who knew Dr. King for this book, and a lot of them, but Belafonte most poignantly said to me, we only like dead radicals in this country. And I felt like King could help us today if we listened to him again, if we went back to his own words, if we reminded some of those students and during Black History Month that there's a piece of the I Have a Dream speech they're not being taught that talks about reparations and police brutality and income inequality. We need the whole King, not just the part that makes us feel good about ourselves. We need to take the hard path and challenge ourselves.
Amen. 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 And similar to Brother Eig, and thank you, Professor Hawkins, for having us here, and Brother Larry Platt for hosting us, and we hope these are some ideas you can really steal. King is treated like a toothless tiger, like a namby-pamby, we are the world, no disrespect to Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson. But he is defanged, and he said stuff that was really tough, especially near the end of his life. He said, I hate to admit it, but most Americans are unconscious racists. Now, you thought Martin Luther King Jr. didn't say that. That was Malcolm X. And he was saying, I come to that conclusion after bitter experience, not denying the legitimacy of fostering relations between black and white and other peoples, but because he had to admit in the first part of his career, he was far more uplifted and optimistic about what was going on. In the latter part of his career, he was far more realistic about what the condition, the plight and predicament of American democracy would be. So in my books, I wanted to really, as Jonathan Eig has so brilliantly done in his biography, mine is kind of a biocriticism, I'm trying to come to grips with the radical legacy of a figure who, as Professor Hawkins said, has been overexposed and therefore underestimated, misunderstood, and as a result, not really useful to us right now as we try to confront some of the problems that he confronted. So in my book, I wanted to talk about the radical legacy. I wanted to talk about faith. I want to talk about the faults, the flaws, the foibles, but also how he overcame all of that and did it before he was 40. Now, I can see a couple of y'all may be 42, all right, and not many of y'all are over 45. I can see that. But can you imagine doing everything he did before he turned 40? In an American society that hated him and loathed him in many ways at the end of his life, and then resurrected him as this iconic figure after his death. And what Jonathan, I'll end here, what Jonathan said, you know, think about Vincent Harding, the great writer, who had that poem, who cited that poem, "Now that he is safely dead, we can celebrate him." And I think that our books try to talk about and resurrect that king who was both enabling of tremendous forces of democracy and challenging to the core of who we are as American citizens.
That's a perfect segue for what I want to ask you both about next. You both talked about our kind of selective remembrance, our selective celebration of King, and how we have to really reclaim all of him. And one of the things that I was really struck by in reading both of your books, and something that I think has been lost, disassociated with King, is some of his more radical ideas and some of his more radical rhetoric, like you said, Michael, calling out unconscious racism on behalf of white America. And one of the things that he did repeatedly, and you both kind of describe really forthrightly in your book, is the way in which he was insistent on calling out white supremacy as really one of the chief problems of trying to achieve not just racial equality, but social justice in our country. And it really struck me in reading these books in this moment to hear and to see white supremacy named so clearly, because today, the term white supremacy has really been weaponized. I mean, it has really been turned into a word that is really almost taboo, again, excised from our public discourse. And to the extent that people do utter it, again, they're dismissed as being radical, maybe even racist themselves, the real racist, right, when you talk about race today. And so I want both of you to talk about, number one, your decision to name white supremacy, especially you, Jonathan, because in this moment, you're writing a book, releasing a book in a moment where that word really does have a bit of a social taboo attached to it. But also why King thought it so important to really use this expressive idea to lay bare the problem as we understand it in America, and what it might offer to us today to think about reclaiming that on behalf of the legacy of our greatest civil rights leader in the history of this country.
That's a great question, and Reverend Dyson is going to answer it much more eloquently than I will, but I will start by saying, and I think I'd love to hear you on this point especially, but I think it's rooted fundamentally in his faith. The Black social gospels teaches us that racism is in conflict with the Bible. The Bible's, one of its fundamental lessons is that we are all made in the image of God. So racism flies in the face of that, and King is brought up with that every fiber of his body. And when he begins to become a public citizen, when he begins to become well-known and celebrated, when he begins leading the Montgomery bus boycott, on December 5th, 1955, at the age of 26, he seems to be striking this message of brotherhood, but in a way that does not address racism. It takes the flip side, the positive side. He says that we, the people who've been treated worst in this country, Black Americans, are the ones who are going to show the way for America to fulfill the promises of democracy and to make true those empty promises of the Declaration of Independence and lead America toward a true nation of brotherhood and sisterhood. And we are going to do that by showing America how much we love this country. We're not here to destroy this society. We're here to join it and to make it better. And if we're wrong in demanding this kind of justice, this kind of equality, then the Constitution must be wrong. And the Bible must be wrong. So it's this message of hope at the same time. So he's welcoming the nation to hear these words and to come with him on this journey. But at the same time, as the Montgomery bus boycott goes on for 381 days, where's he going to raise money? To New York and to Chicago. And he's saying, I need your help, but I'm coming back because you're just as racist here as those crackers in the South. We've got to address the segregation, the fundamental racism at the root of society in Chicago and New York, and I'll be back to talk about that. So we have this perception of King that only in the later years does he begin to speak out on Northern racism, on the systemic racism, the economic inequality, but he's actually saying it all along. It's just we're not listening because we're focused on, as King is focused, on the task at hand, which is breaking down segregation laws and fighting for voter rights. But all along he's saying, don't forget, I'm not here as an activist. I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as a preacher. And my message is bigger, it's broader. And this is part of my ministry. I'm here to save souls, and that means addressing the fundamental issues. And he's saying, I'll be back to talk about those things.
Yes, where Martin Luther King Jr. meets Arnold Schwarzenegger, to be sure, because he was trying to terminate white supremacy. Come on. But, I mean, I could listen to this man talk all day about Dr. King with such melody and such euphony and such symphonic sweep across the horizon of ideas that King easily and effortlessly accessed. He was also, despite the brilliance of what Jonathan Igue has just talked about, which is extremely important, not a Johnny-come-lately to the North challenge that King delivered, but from the very beginning, because after all, he had been trained up north, right? Outside of Philadelphia, Crozer Theological Seminary, preached here for J. Pius Barber, was in love with a white woman and about to marry her.
Read the book.
I mean, King was ahead of the curve in many ways, but then they discouraged him saying, if you come out with a white woman being a civil rights leader, it might not work in 1956. So King is in Crozer Theological Seminary here, and then in Boston University. So that is very important. But he's also being pushed simultaneously by Malcolm X, right, a little later, who's talking endlessly and relentlessly about world white supremacy. One of the posthumous books that comes out from Malcolm, of course, is entitled that, 4 Speeches About the End of World White Supremacy. And so white supremacy was not endemic to King or endemic to a movement that he adopted. It was in the air and the atmosphere. And how you responded to it was extremely valuable and very important. And both of them from religious viewpoints. One from the cosmos, constituted by a counterintuitive religious formation, that is the black Muslims, against the dominance of white America, including the very Christian faith that King appropriated and reappropriated for the purposes of salvation and liberation. And King wanted to tell, can you imagine Dr. King speaking to Donnie Swaggart right now, who's saying, I know you're gonna call me racist, but I'm gonna challenge the black church. If you support Kamala, she is the devil and you are going to hell. Now, that kind of erratic, a theology that sanctifies every instinct of evil we can think of, you would think you got better time to go talk about your daddy who was hanging out with prostitutes and crying, I want to know what the Lord will do, right? Here you are admonishing the black church and demonizing us for supporting her. This is an example of the white supremacy that Dr. King spoke about. White supremacy is what? The conscious or unconscious belief in the inherent superiority of one group and the inherent inferiority of the other. And so King wanted to make clear that this is the case. But his genius was he appropriated the sermons of white liberals, William Hamilton and others, and you do a brilliant job talking about that. I talk about it in my book as well. And he recycled white theology, white liberal theology, to the very white ears that were hearing it for the first time so he could soften the landing of the argument about white supremacy by using their language. In other words, he wasn't Stax Record down in Memphis, he was Berry Gordy at Motown. Right? And Berry Gordy wanted to make sure that the white earlobe would not be offended by the black sound. That was King at that level.
Yeah, and can I just add one
Yes,
thing?
please.
Why is it essential in a book published in 2024 to talk about white supremacy? The one thing we haven't touched upon yet is the reason that our government, the same government that celebrates King today with a national holiday, the reason that government decided to try to destroy Dr. King was indisputably only because of white supremacy. That the FBI determined after listening to King's phone calls for a little while that he had no interest in communism. So why did the wiretaps continue? Why were they actually installed in more places in his home and office after this conclusion that he was not interested in communism? Why did they begin this clear-cut campaign to destroy him, to identify a replacement, to encourage him to commit suicide? The answer is simple, because J. Edgar Hoover and other people in the American government, including presidents, attorney generals, Kennedy, Johnson, members of Congress, members of the media, were afraid that if King succeeded in uniting a movement that included not just black people, but white people, and not just his Christian followers, but his black Muslim followers, that this posed a threat to the status quo, to the white supremacy.
So can I follow up on that? Because I think that some people might suggest, there was even some discussion on an earlier panel, that race is no longer an issue, right? So we might have people, again, say that if you're talking about race, you're the real racist, you're the real problem. And so can we speak to the issue of how it is that we find that Hispanics and whites and even some blacks, voted for a candidate who vilified immigrants? What does that have to do, if anything, with white supremacy?
I'm going to let this young man over here answer that.
Oh, no. I'm going to I want to hear you on this. But I will say that I think, and I've had friends say to me that doesn't this prove that we're not racist anymore? Because, look, everybody voted for Trump, including a lot of people of color. Well, I don't think it proves that at all. I think it proves we're racist, and that there are a lot of people who are voting out of self-interest, out of anger, looking for justification for their rage, for their frustrations. And it's just easier to answer rage with rage, as opposed to what Dr. King challenged us to do, is to answer rage with love. It's easier. It allows us to stay isolated. It requires us not to speak to the people with whom we might disagree, not to challenge ideas. It makes us feel like we have company in our anger, and I think that's what's at the root of this, in addition to racism. And Dr. King's message was that we can overcome that. We can live with our frustration. We can live with our maladjustment, as he called it. It's normal to feel maladjusted when there's so much injustice in the world. The question is, what do you do with that maladjustment? How do you remain creatively maladjusted, as he put it, so that we exert our energies toward loving one another as opposed to isolating ourselves in that hatred?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, King is a refounding father, right? He helps dig deeper the wells of democracy that replenish our conception of who we are as a nation. And for a black man to do that, this was part of the problem with Barack Obama, that the American standard would now be articulated literally in a black voice. That this brown-skinned black man would be the standard bearer as the most powerful man in the world for 8 years, hence the resistance to him. But when we think about Dr. King and white supremacy, the truth is, as Jonathan has indicated, that the American government was against him so fundamentally, tried to undermine him at every turn. And to suggest that race ain't the issue, is an old canard, right? The left has used it as well. No, it's about class. It's not about race. I was on a panel with the great Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, and he said, you know, the communists were talking about coming to Harlem to really recruit black people to become members of the Communist Party because they were better. And he said, a black man raised his hand and said, can I ask you a question? To the white gentleman who was the communist, he said, after the revolution comes, will you still be white? Because the persistence of whiteness was not skin color. It was outlook. It was worldview. It was the possibility of privileging one thing over the next. And so even to talk about class at the expense of race was to misunderstand that white unions were systemically barring black people from being involved at the class level. And so when we talk about, you know, it's about the working class, I hear the autopsies now, Bernie Sanders and others. The black working class voted overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. So when you say working class, you're already eviscerating, you're erasing the racial dynamic that determines the class status. As I said earlier, race makes class hurt more. And if we're gonna get real honest about it, can I tell the truth or should I lie? Do you want me to tell the truth? Tell the truth? When you look at the disaggregated data, 54% of white women who are eligible to vote voted for Donald Trump. And when you think about that, as someone has said, if you're gonna let me be honest about it, this is an armchair ethnography. Somebody said, well, white women who looked at Kamala saw a white man who was married to her deferring to her in a way that her white husband never did. And then white men looked at her and said, you got a white guy named Tim Walz who's deferring to you and lording it over to the white man. Now, that's armchair ethnography, that's grassroots epistemology, but howsoever, as James Brown would say, it do be bearing a point. And the point is that there are racial elements, collective unconscious at stake. And so white supremacy is deep in America. And I end by saying this. What King fought against is what we have now seen triumph with Donald Trump. The real religion in America is not evangelical piety, it's whiteness. The real impulse to government is not democracy, it's whiteness. And when you recognize that, you have an easier time coming to grips with how in America could seduce even black and Latino people to at a point become complicit in their own demise because the seductive character of white supremacy continues to be persistent in our era.
Amen and amen. So both of you do such an incredible job of drawing a much more complete and holistic picture of King's life and legacy. And so I want to just share with the audience one of the things that struck me about how both of you trace this arc of King's life, particularly in the public eye as a civil rights leader. And as you have both acknowledged, there were different kind of phases of that public life. There were different versions of King, if you will, that were presented throughout. And I want to identify each of them briefly and ask which one of these versions do you think is most needed to kind of inspire and instruct us today. So first, there is the 1955 King who burst on the stage as the de facto leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, leading the Montgomery bus boycott, again, ushering in the civil rights movement. This was a man, as you have said, Jonathan, deeply religious. His call to arms at that time, right, as a part of the nonviolent movement for social change was love thine enemy, right? He was calling on black people to love the people who were harming them. And then we shift to kind of the middle stage where he's now at the apex of his public stature, right? He's standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and he's giving his dream speech. He's now the leader of this national civil rights organization. He has alliances not only with the Johnson administration, but as you said, with, you know, white liberal allies around the country. He was instrumental in the passage of civil rights rights legislation, including both the Civil Rights Act as well as the Voting Rights Act. And yet he was starting to get pushback even from within his own party, not to mention, as Michael said, outside the party, from Malcolm X, from people like Stokely Carmichael calling for Black Power, right? So there was already this kind of dual accountability, both to the kind of larger movement and making progress, but also to kind of shifts in the Black movement. And then you go to the end of his life, right before he died in 1968, and this is where the radical king emerges. This is a king who has now moved from Southern segregation, right, to the northern ghettos, where he is witnessing that these liberal sympathizers are also a part of the problem in terms of racial inequality. The Vietnam War has started. He starts to oppose the Vietnam War. This king actually said, "I have witnessed my dream become a nightmare," as he identifies that it's not just about white supremacy, it's also about materialism and militarism in the United States, right? And this king is probably more despondent and a little bit more beleaguered than we've seen him throughout his life. And so again, he's troubled by the intractability of the problems that he's confronting. Which of these kings, they're very different kings, all equally important, all contributing something meaningful to our understanding of what it means to stand, right, and fight for social justice and to speak truth to power. I'm curious, which of these versions do you think is most needed in this moment, and what are the lessons that we should be drawing?
I'm not going to choose one, but I'm going to focus on an element that runs through all three of those kings that you identified, and that's fear. And that might not be what you expect to hear me say that I think of when I think of King, but let's think about fear for a second, because when King emerges on December 5th, 1955, and agrees to speak that day, on the first day of the Montgomery bus boycott, he has a panic attack. He has 20 minutes to prepare his speech, and he has a panic attack. And he overcomes that panic attack to give the speech that launches his new phase in his life. And after that bus boycott, which lasts 381 days and does not look like it's going to succeed for a long time, he wanders through the desert for a long time. What do I do now? He writes to one of his college professors, "People are going to be expecting miracles from me." He's 27 years old. And he fails for the first couple of years afterwards. And he sees he's 27, he sees younger activists picking up the ball and referring to him as the old grandfather of the movement already. And what does he do? He listens and learns from them. And what happens after during phase two, after the March on Washington, when he seems to be at the peak of his powers, and he becomes a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and his own government turns on him, and he's facing constant death threats. And once again, the movement seems to be floundering. And as he begins to go north, and moves to Chicago and tries to call out the racism and segregation there, and gets bashed in the media for it, and begins to speak out on the Vietnam War and gets bashed for it. And then, as you said, in 1968, he begins planning the Poor People's Campaign, really the culmination of all of his philosophy. He's going to move this from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. He's going to focus on the core issues of racism and economic inequality, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed income, remaking American capitalism. He's doubling down over and over again. The fear never goes away. He's getting constant death threats. He's by now been arrested 29 times, stabbed in the chest, had his home bombed twice, had the windows shot out of his home numerous times, knows that his own government is spreading the message that King is a danger to society, that we, the government, must do everything in our powers to keep him from uniting the masses. And he goes on planning this Poor People's Campaign when it feels like no one's listening to him anymore. And we know exactly what's going through his mind. We know that he's scared because the FBI is taping these calls, and we can now read the transcripts. And he's having to explain to some of his closest friends his frustrations. And yet he's still there. And when he gets the call to come to Memphis, and his friends and close advisors are saying, "That's not where you need to focus," he says, "That's exactly where I need to focus, because these are the people I've been talking about all this time." So he's constantly overcoming that fear to keep fighting. There's nobody who had more good reason to lose hope than Martin Luther King. And he continued to believe that we could be better, that this country could do better.
Yeah, amen. I mean, the difference between the men and the boys, the leaders and those who were followers. And then we got into Memphis, right? That's the line. Because King had been always afeared, speaking of fear, of going to Memphis. A friend of his, Reverend Harold Middlebrooks, told me this back when I was in Knoxville in the late 70s, early 80s. And he said he always would go in and then go out the same day if he could. And so he's facing his own fear. And he preached often that the measure of a man, the measure of a person, the measure of a citizen, of a human being, is not where you stand in easy times, but in difficult times, and that the fear that you have not overcome you, and that despite the fear, you speak out and speak up. So I think the king I would point to, I'll do like Jonathan and embrace them all, because we need all of them. We need the king of love, who believes that we can transform America. We need the king who was in 1963 at the Sunlit Summit of Expectation, where he unveiled the oratory and rhetorical magic that would transform and mesmerize American citizens. And then the king who was bitterly disappointed in the denouement, the decline of what America is. And don't forget, all the time he's dealing with white supremacy and the naysayers from without, he's got inside hating going on, right? He's got he's got Roy Wilkins, who is suspicious of him. Why is he going to the streets and not the courts? And Thurgood Marshall was like, he might as well treated him like he was Snoop Dogg. Like, how dare this man embarrass us? Because we're supposed to go to the courts, not into the streets. And when he delivered that famous I Have a Dream speech, they gave him 8 minutes, he took 19. They wanted to speak after King because they thought the cameras were going to be gone. Only one camera was supposed to be there from CBS. But because the movement was so powerful, ABC and NBC, I know young people don't know that we only had 3 stations, right? Y'all got 3 stations now for every fetish you have in American culture. We had 3 stations, and then, remember, they used to go out at the end of the day, at the end of the night, when you heard the American, the song, dun, 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 that TV's off. They joined, and then his crowd grew even larger, and King was able to summon the depth of his spiritual genius and speak to America. And then I think, and I'll end here, the greatest speech he ever gave was the night before he was murdered. Because he's in his bed, he doesn't feel well. The newspapers are writing that King is losing his touch. He didn't want to go out there. One of the few vanities he reserved to himself is not to speak to smaller audiences. And he predicted it was raining cats and dogs, eaten by the Haitians, I'm sure. And, all right, anyway. So, raining cats and dogs, and then King is in his hotel room in the Lorraine Motel, and they call him and say, this is your audience. He gets up, gets over to there, and delivers off the dome one of the greatest speeches that he has ever delivered, that any human being has ever delivered, in the face of apparent agony over death threats. And I've been subjected to death threats. I'm sure all of us up here have been. When you're speaking and you know somebody really has it out to hurt you and you still go on, he did this every day of his life. So for me, that Martin Luther King Jr., who gave up his life in the service of his fellow human beings and his willingness to do so despite the almost inevitability that he would lose his life in the midst of that, that's the king I continue to celebrate and love and embrace.
With your permission, we'll go a few minutes over because I want to hear from a couple of you at least. Is that cool? So who wants to ask a question? Again, no speechifying. You got it up here. Oh, how the hell am I going to get there? All righty. Say who you are.
My name is Laura Schwingle. Thank you so much for this panel. So I'm one of those people who've been a lifelong protester, trying to do the right thing. It's getting really scary out there again. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's been scary for a long time, especially for people of color. But, when we talk about the civil disobedience, I worry right now that like protests are basically going to land on ears that really don't care, right? There's no shame in the administration that just took over. And so there's, is it effective to really do that kind of protest, or do we need to look at civil disobedience in other ways, right? Like boycotts, or, I'm trying to figure out, what's the way to have an impact when you feel like there's no hope in swaying this government. And so where do we turn now?
Well, I'll briefly say, it was that way when King was alive too, believe it or not, right? Now, there are peaks and valleys. Most social movements depend upon social momentum that will be eclipsed in 5, maybe 10 years, right? King's public ministry lasts 12 years. From the time, as Jonathan said, that he discovered who he was, then he was in the wilderness like Jesus, figuring out where he's going to go and what he's going to do, and he was not successful. And he's looking at John Lewis, and he's looking at Julian Bond, he's looking at the Greensboro folk, and he's trying to figure it out, but he's listening, and then he finds his stride. Most black people did not participate in the civil rights movement. Most Americans were not swayed by it. Very small numbers. So I would say that even now, although there's an option glut available, just like so many more stations, everybody's protesting everything at every time. So you're trying to, what will pierce the noise? What will break through? And I think that King did what he did in honest conscience in response to what was available. If King were alive today, he might be on social media. He might drop out of X and then go over to Instagram or fan base or whatever, trying to figure out the best way to convince people to do things, but he would maintain a sense of integrity. And he would never give up the belief that a few people can transform America. If we can get a few people to stand up against this vicious orange apparition, this lugubrious leech, this dim-witted dictator, this foolish fascist, maybe we can use panels like this to call him names to at least inspire some resistance against his obnoxious behavior.
And I would just add, without the alliteration, that that King was trying to raise our consciousness, whether we listened or not, whether the world responded, whether the government responded. And Reverend Bernard Lafayette said to me that he was the greatest, strongest crowbar America ever produced. And I think this is what you're saying. You pry where you can. You crack open until a little light comes through, and maybe some other people will follow you.
Mm-hmm. Let's do one last quick question.
Oh, I just get one.
You get one.
Oh, dang.
You gotta pick.
Okay. Hi, my name is Tynesia Wilson. I'm a contributor with the Philly Download. This question is for Dr. Michael. What do you think, or what is your vision for faith-based activism here in Philadelphia today?
Yes, ma'am. Well, the reason I pause, because Jesse Jackson said the black church often had Martin Luther King Jr. on the fans and Billy Graham's theology in the pulpit. And I'm afraid that at this point, what we have to do is relinquish certain platitudes that we've embraced as Christians and become far more radical like Martin Luther King Jr. And that means, to me, being a strategic atheist. Martin Luther King Jr. said, I look at their churches sometimes and I wonder who is their God. I can't worship that God. I don't know that religion that will allow a human being to stand up in the pulpit, break from the pulpit to go lynch a human being, and then come back to pronounce the benediction. When the Southern Baptist Convention goes out of its way to exclude women and also to reinforce its alienation from people of color, I think we can have no truck with that. I think we have to say to the Donnie Swaggarts, to the white evangelicals, and look, we are, as black evangelical, I come out of it, and all evangelical means is you're going to evangelize the world, ask them to be born again, and to ask Jesus into their lives, right? However you configure that. I think what the church has to do here in Philadelphia is to look at the monumental misery of those who are marginalized, those whose voices are suppressed, and to stand with them. And at the end of the day, your religion has to be love, not Christianity, not denominationalism, right? My religion is, if you say you love, what did Jesus say? You say you better to be a person who says they ain't gonna go and goes anyhow than a person who says they're gonna go and don't show up. The church, to me, has proclaimed that it will show up and so often hasn't. So I believe more readily and will join forces with someone who is an atheist or an agnostic or not involved with the religion at all or another religion altogether and join arms with them to protest, to fight, and to bear witness to the ultimate power of God against the injustice that prevails than siding with people because they are in the same religion. Billy Graham and Joel Osteen share the same ostensible commitment to Jesus, but I know not the God that they speak of. I'm an atheist to that tradition, and I stand with those who believe in the church of love and the God of human compassion for their fellow citizens. If the church does that, I think we'd be in better shape.
So could there be a better place to end than with the Church of Love? Thank you to this terrific panel.